we're going to discuss our favourite genres, and in branching out to that, sort of compare them, what it's like to GM them, what it's like to DM them, what it's like to be a player as well in the various settings. Of course, you know, as you know, you can play anything ranging from far high fantasy, which we normally see as in the past, but that's a bit of a misnomer because, I mean, when are they set? All the way through to the very far reaches of the future. And, well, who wants to kick off our discussion tonight? Who's got a particular favourite genre? Perhaps if we start at either end of the spectrum, who likes fantasy then?
I love fantasy. I think it's weird because fantasy, especially as a DM, I feel that fantasy allows you to create more crazy characters. I don't know if that's just me, but like when I was DMing, I mean, I create wacky characters anyway, regardless.
Do you?
But like, yeah, but like, I don't know. Fantasy just lends itself more to making like these weird characters. Like, yeah. Oh, there you go. There's one of them. That's
Great character.
I mean,
yeah,
I'd say
exactly.
that character is so good. You could put. I expect to walk into a spaceport, and there's the customs, shimmering
Yeah.
chrome everywhere, and you walk out, it's like, "Hello there." You
Yeah.
know, that's a pan-dimensional kind of person.
And also like battles as well is quite like, you know, you've got the like, you know, the epic Lord of the Rings sort of like massive battles you can have, which are really cool and epic. Which you can do that in sci-fi, I guess, but we're not talking about sci-fi at the moment. We're talking about fantasy. But yeah, I do like fantasy. I'm a big fan. But then you can also act. You know, sorry, James. You can also just, you know, you can put in elements of technology in fantasy as well, like we talked about a couple of weeks ago with guns and things like that.
Yes, of course we can. And just to clarify, we're going to try and keep a rough structure to this talk, but I'm going to let it fly free and go a bit more organic than I normally do, than can put my control upon it. And of course, do remember that if you want to chip in or ask a question, you can as the chat. But yes, yeah, fantasy conjures up this setting of bold knights and wizards and archers and all the fun things that we're fond of seeing so much. What about you, Dan? What is it? You must like fantasy, do you?
I surprisingly, I do.
Yeah.
God, it would be weird if I didn't, wouldn't it?
Yeah.
It's weird, isn't it, how something that is so silly and niche from a kind of when you look at it from the outside, is actually quite generic and sort of normal within the concept of RPGs. You know, it is the vanilla RPG setting is fantasy. That's kind of the baseline. Whereas when you look out from outside, it's weird and strange, but it's nice because it's become this. Because of Tolkien, we have a shared language of what we sort of think this is, and it's moved away in recent years from kind of it being medieval Europe to being very different. But it's a very versatile chassis. It lets you tell a lot of different kinds of stories and have a little different kinds of genres in it. You know, you can have horror stories, you can have adventure stories, you can have very quiet, easy, personal stories in it. I read a thing about a little while ago about some people who ran a game of Quest that was all about the hobbits putting on a birthday party, and there was no peril in it at all. It was just about how the hobbits put on a party, and I was like, that sounds tremendous.
Oh my God, that's
but
so you.
But you know, you can, because arguably the lines between fantasy and space opera are very blurred. You know, like Starfinder is a science fantasy, which is why you can have kind of laser guns and stuff in your fantasy setting, and the sort of the two primary ones, I think, for good reason, you know, Forgotten Realms and even more so Pathfinder, I think, they are theme parks that are designed to have lots of different countries, all of which are completely different and have loads of different things. And like there is, you know, you've got Nidal, which is Horrorland, and you've got Varizia is Epic Adventure Land, and you've got Frostworld up the top, and you've got the one where Numeria, where everyone's got laser guns and there are robot scorpions. It's crazy. It's so weird. And there's the Wild West, which is kind of Arkansas, and you know, so it's designed so that you can basically have whatever games you want, and that's kind of how the world is built, so you can have whatever campaign you want in it. So it's weird that something that is, and especially something that used to be so, people get very precious about fantasy and what is correct fantasy, you know, how elves should be, and just the drama that people get into about women in fantasy and disability in fantasy and representation and anything like this, and it's just like, oh my god, you're kidding me? You've got a scorpion with a laser in his butt fighting a barbarian. You know, we can, anything can be anything. Enough with this.
It's true, and of course that's one of the reasons everyone role plays, because you can step outside of yourself in the bounds of this rather humdrum world that most of us exist in. I mean, just addressing something in the chat, Eric, you asked how do you feel about tech and guns in a fantasy setting, and Chris rightly points out we did talk quite a lot at length about that a few weeks back. It is an interesting subject though, because of course, you know, like you say, people do get quite precious about fantasy. But what do you think? What kind of appeals about the fantasy setting that you can't get in other settings? Here's a question for you.
Ooh.
So what's a unique? Give me a USP of the fantasy setting that you're just like, but you don't have this.
I think. Go ahead, Ross.
No, I was just going to say, like, I think with fantasy, you have to think outside the box. You can't just like go, you know, you haven't got all the modern day things. If you're going to do a modern, like, you can't just ring up. You're like, I need to call someone. I'll just ring them up on my phone. Boop, boop, boop. Or you shoot them. Like, it's that Indiana Jones thing. That guy's like swirling the sword around, and then he just shoots the guy. You know, there's not much story in that, is there? Like, you know, it makes you think of new ways to do things and put yourself in that world, I guess.
Yeah, I suppose in terms of fantasy, you know, because everything's much slower and everything tends to be on a smaller scale from a day-to-day basis. So you can't just bamf somewhere generally. Obviously, there's teleport and there's various ways around it. But let's just take a standard fantasy setting. You know, if you want to go somewhere, you've got to ride there or you've got to walk there. And that means staying the night in the woods. It means hunting a bit of food. It means doing all this kind of stuff, which you might or might not focus on as a DM. But is that something that really sort of comes to the fore in fantasy? Is it the sort of the little things, do you think, Dan?
I think that certainly does, and certainly there's a reason that we have such a love for low-level fantasy. Not in terms of like the tech or the amount of fantasy, but like playing those small games when camping in the woods is a big deal and things like that. There's a reason why we like those, because there's a sense of a very big world when you play fantasy, because you can't just fly somewhere in a day. And it's why I'm always quite reluctant to bring in teleportation magic and means of fast travel and things like that, because I like the idea that you never visit everywhere in the world. The world always seems bigger. And that's one of the joys of fantasy. It brings us back to this time when there is a sort of feeling of exploration and of a world that's bigger than us. Another thing that it does very nicely is that it flexes very well in terms of what you can do in the world before it stops being plausible. Sci-fi can do it, space opera can do it to an extent, but kind of you can, in a fantasy game, you can go into a dungeon full of other creatures, you can blow them up with fireballs, you can take all of their stuff and you can walk away, and it doesn't necessarily completely break the narrative. Because that's kind of how that game's grown up. And there's lots of conversations to have about, but you can do it in more interesting ways, and there are other ways of approaching that, and not having mindless monsters and things. But it does kind of work doing that. Whereas when you do that in a modern setting, if you're playing something like Cthulhu, or you're playing a World of Darkness game or anything like that, that's sort of hard baked into it. Like if you went into a building and killed 20 people and took all their money and walked away, that has a much bigger effect psychologically. Like, you have to address that in a different way as your character. You can't just write that off as kind of part of the fun. And so it kind of has a weight to it, which it doesn't necessarily have in fantasy. That doesn't mean you can't tell those stories with fantasy, but I think fantasy gives you a levity which you can lean into if you want to play in that kind of space. If you want to, if you want to build sandcastles and knock them over and have fun with it, I think you can do that. It also helps that, thanks to things like the Peter Jackson Lord of the Rings movies, we have a sense of epicness attached to fantasy that we don't necessarily do to to other things, it's very immediate and very easy to kind of conjure up the idea of loads of horsemen and women riding down a hill to crash into the Dark Lord, and that's an image we can all understand very quickly and conjure up, and it's a good vehicle for those kind of stories.